prevailing analysis is fixated on kinetic exchange. Media outlets amplify footage of new jet-powered Russian drones striking targets, and the Pentagon validates this focus with contracts for space-based missile defense systems. This is a strategic misdirection. The conventional arms race is a high-cost, low-yield distraction from the primary vector of modern conflict. The real threat is not explosive. It is silent. 97% of global data, the lifeblood of the financial system, travels not through the air, but through a handful of undersea fiber optic cables. This is the planet's central nervous system. Severing these vectors requires no nuclear payload. It requires specialized submersibles and precise deniable sabotage. The economic consequence is not damage. It is erasure. The second front of this silent war is orbital. While firms like AST SpaceMobile are tasked with tracking incoming ballistics, the asymmetric counter is not to outgun them, but to blind them. Ground-based lasers can permanently disable the optical sensors of critical surveillance and communication satellites. This is not science fiction, it is deployed capability. The objective is to create a total information blackout. This protocol creates the blind Leviathan, a nation-state stripped of its satellite intelligence and disconnected from the global financial network, retains its full kinetic arsenal, its carriers, its silos, its bombers, but has lost its eyes and ears. It is a creature of immense power plunged into sensory deprivation. In this state, the standard operating procedure degrades. The threshold for a launch-on-warning protocol drops to near zero. A systemic panic is triggered, where the only response to silence is overwhelming preemptive force. This is the mechanism that turns an economic liability into a global trigger. A nation-state does not have the luxury of bankruptcy. When its balance sheet collapses under the weight of its own liabilities, it cannot default. It must escalate. This is a solvency crisis, where the state's very legitimacy is the asset at risk. The motive is not conquest, it is survival. Observe the Russian Federation. The initial phase of the Ukraine conflict created a critical domestic liability. Authoritative analysis from institutions like CSIS frames the protracted war not as a strategic choice, but as an existential threat to the regime's solvency. The kinetic cost abroad and the rising unpopularity at home created a negative feedback loop, threatening systemic collapse. When a state is cornered by conventional weakness, its protocol is to pivot to asymmetry. It must create a new attack vector where the cost-benefit analysis is inverted. We have documented evidence of this protocol in action. Russia's deployment of a previously unseen jet-powered one-way attack drone to strike high-value targets like HIMARS launchers. This is not technological advancement. It is a calculated response to a solvency crisis. The state is liquidating its technological and industrial capacity to generate cheap, disposable kinetic assets. The objective changes from winning a war to making the war too expensive for the opponent to sustain. Weakness forces a launch-on-warning posture where any liability, economic, technological, or civil, becomes a trigger for asymmetric escalation. The math is the weapon. According to the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, a modern battle tank is a $5 million asset. The first-person view drone, a weaponized consumer product, costs $500. This is not a battlefield anomaly. It is a mathematical certainty. The kinetic cost to destroy is now 4 orders of magnitude lower than the cost to build. This economic imbalance is the single most important metric in modern warfare, creating a systemic solvency crisis for conventional armies. This protocol is the democratization of violence. The barrier to entry for projecting lethal force has been systematically erased. It is the new leverage for any state facing a critical liability. We see this blueprint executed now, as reports confirm Russia is deploying new jet-powered attack drones specifically to hunt and liquidate high-value assets like HIMARS launchers. When facing a technological gap, the protocol is not to compete symmetrically. It is to weaponize the opponent's balance sheet, imposing unsustainable kinetic costs until their industrial base collapses. The protocol of asymmetric escalation is not executed in a vacuum. It requires a theater of operations, a gray zone, where plausible deniability is high and the kinetic cost is low. These are not the primary fronts. They are the proxy laboratories for 21st century conflict. Observe the blueprint. A nation-state like Iran, facing a systemic solvency crisis and internal revolt, cannot afford a conventional war. The lethal force documented by UN officials is the symptom of a terminal liability. The protocol dictates that this internal pressure must be externalized, weaponized, and exported into a proxy zone to create leverage. Simultaneously, Russia confronts a technological gap against Western systems. The response is not capitulation. It is the rapid deployment of new jet-powered attack drones. As seen in recent operations, these systems are designed to nullify high-value assets like HIMARS launchers at a fraction of the cost. This is the weaponization of economic disparity. CSIS reports confirm this pattern. These low-cost, high-impact assets are not meant for frontline attrition. They are ideal for proliferation into gray zone conflicts. Reports of emergent instability in Western-aligned nations, from South Africa to Canada, are therefore not the cause of systemic risk. They are the potential staging grounds, the designated arenas where these new kinetic tools are tested and calibrated. The United States countermove is to escalate the theater vertically. The Pentagon's contract with AST Space Mobile for missile defense is not just about defense. It is about establishing orbital overwatch. This creates a launch-on-warning posture that extends to the entire globe, turning space into the ultimate high ground for gray zone interdiction. The feedback loop is now clear. An economic liability in one state, like India's battery dependency on China, becomes a potential target. An internal solvency crisis in another, like Iran, creates the motive for asymmetric attack. The gray zone is simply where these vectors converge, systematically lowering the threshold for escalation. This is not chaos. It is a clinical, predictable process. The nuclear protocol is not designed for patience. It's a mathematical function of time and distance. The doctrine is known as launch-on-warning. It is a systemic tripwire. Once ground-based radar or space-based assets detect an inbound kinetic launch, the defender has minutes, not hours, to retaliate before their own silos are turned to glass. It is a zero-sum calculation with no margin for error. This entire architecture, however, rests on a single point of failure: data integrity. The sensor grid is now the primary vector of attack. Programs like the U.S. Missile Defense Systems contract with AST Space Mobile highlight this reality. Deterrence is now a function of a satellite network. This network is the new front line. This creates the fog of digital war. A cyber attack potentially delivered by a low observable system like the new Russian jet-powered drones doesn't need to be kinetic. It simply has to blind the radar or spoof the satellite feed. CSIS analysts confirm that a sophisticated electronic warfare package can create ghost fleets, or more critically, a total information blackout. The commander is now facing a solvency crisis of information. The protocol was not written for ambiguity. Is the blackout a system error, or is it the precursor to impact? The liability, total dependence on a digital reality becomes the kinetic trigger. The protocol dictates that in the absence of disconfirming data, the last valid data is the truth. Fear of decapitation forces the launch. The weakness accelerates the escalation. This is not a bug in the system. It is the system's core feature. The calibration shot will not be a port blackout or a cyber attack on a bank. That is a legacy playbook. The new protocol targets the vectors of force projection before they become kinetic. A nation-state facing a systemic liability, like Russia's technological gap or Iran's internal solvency crisis, must now escalate asymmetrically to rebalance the ledger. Within the next 12 months, expect a sudden cascading system failure of a commercial low Earth orbit satellite constellation. The target will be a dual-use network, one explicitly contracted for U.S. missile defense programs, consistent with public filings like the AST Space Mobile Award. The event will manifest as a kinetic impact, officially attributed to untracked orbital debris. Plausible deniability is the primary feature. The operational objective is not destruction, but data collection, to measure the signal-to-response time of U.S. Space Command and to quantify the degradation of strategic communications. This is a launch-on-warning scenario, inverted. The shot is not the prelude to an attack. The shot is the attack. It is a non-lethal, attribution-impossible event designed to test the kinetic cost of a conventional liability. This is the new threshold.